I'm less interested in research. I'm more interested in defending self, or defending my old beliefs. Because this brain has only two things on its mind. And that is, will something annihilate me, or will something harm me? And when it interprets that that's possible, it reacts. Somebody only has to come up to you and say, you, and your amygdala is ready to go because you think you're going to say something negative. It's so quick, it's so rapid. But think about it. It's also extremely valuable because it protects us. It's also the source of memory for the first 3 years of life. And that has long-term value. I remember from early life the things that might put my life in danger. Okay? Of course, sometimes the things that may have surprised us or alerted our amygdala early in life aren't that threatening. But we continue to think that way long into life. And then we have to have some reframing to overcome it. Now, there are more neurons that go from the amygdala up to the thinking brain than there are neurons that go down from the thinking brain down to the amygdala. What does that mean? It means the emotions are incredibly powerful, more so than the thinking brain. And what's fascinating with humans is, once the amygdala is ignited, it's hard to shut it down. Whereas in animals, once the amygdala is ignited, once the threat has disappeared, the amygdala dies down. Because we can imagine other possibilities or potentialities for evil or destruction or harm. And so our amygdala stays on alert a lot longer than any animal. We also have learned that the amygdala decreases its activity when there are smiling faces, kind words, and gentle touch. You know, I wish again we'd learned that diplomacy may be as effective as aggression. Now, what might excite your amygdala or her amygdala could be different or could be the same. It's based upon experience. Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist, says, we don't come into life pre-assembled. We get glued together by our experiences. And those who grow up in hostile, violent, neglectful environments are going to have the 250,000 neurons produced every day in a child. And what are the neurons going to remember? Don't trust life. Life is dangerous. As opposed to the child who grows up in a loving, compassionate, noticing environment. Then the neurons say, you can trust people. You can go beyond here and trust even strangers. Because we also have another part of the brain called the left prefrontal cortex. And it houses our humanity. Shakespeare called it the vault of heaven. Paul McLean called it the angel lobe. In a book that I wrote recently, I called it holy tissue, special tissue. This is where our humanity is housed, where we are able to be responsive and mature rather than just instinctive and automatic and defensive. It has 5 capacities, which you will not find in other species. Now, other species do have left prefrontal cortex, but they're small and undeveloped, and therefore not that functional for other animals. Somewhat, but not so, like for human beings. All right, this is the part of the brain that allows me to step back and observe my experience. It creates consciousness, awareness. Now, I did therapy for 14 years with depression. And of course, the people who are most difficult to deal with in therapy are those who are defended against awareness. No awareness, no choice. Okay? And it's just like beating your head against the wall when someone doesn't have that kind of capacity. Which means they're putting some kind of strictures on their left prefrontal cortex. They're not able to step back and observe and see their experience or observe even what others are doing. Incredibly important. Secondly, it also enhances relationships because I can step back and see you as separate from me. And you have your needs and your rights in and of themselves, apart from me. I like what Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa once said. Have you ever seen someone throw a bone to a pack of dogs? And one dog said to the other dog, after you. The dog is bound by the present, by the immediacy, by the instinct. You and I have the ability to regulate that part of ourselves and say, after you. Thirdly, this is the part of the brain that allows us to use our imagination, to use symbols and language, to deal with paradoxes and ambiguities. Fourth, this is the part of the brain that can put the brakes on the big one. This is the part of the brain that says, don't do that, don't say that. Okay? That's why most codes of morality are in the negatives. It's some kind of a check on this immediate defensive survival brain. I wish more people who send emails would think about that. And then fifth, this is the part of the brain, the only part of the brain that deals with the future. We can plan, schedule, look ahead, be imaginative, create options, see possibilities, be hopeful. Without this part of the brain, learning is really incapacitated and is also all change. Now, what's also fascinating about this brain is it's the only part of the brain that is subject to environmental factors. Every other part of the brain becomes fully equipped, dealing with the past or the present. This part of the brain, from the third trimester of pregnancy until about the age of 20 or 25, is still picking up messages and learning in the environment. And of course, the most important thing of any environment are people. Many of you may have recalled when communism broke up into pieces that in Romania they discovered these orphanages. And when they entered into the orphanages, the children were like zombies. They wouldn't even respond to loud noises. They would stare into space. That's because 40 to 50 children were stuffed into a unit with one adult or one nurse caring for them. Okay? And without that personal contact, the self does not develop. So what's important for you as educators is your own self, your own presence, and how you're functioning, because it affects the lives of other people. It's a system. And there are those that will be in your midst who were not sufficiently noticed or were inadequately noticed in their environment, and they are a special case, and they are more difficult for us to deal with. I was quite impressed by the fact that Pope John Paul invited Daniel Siegel, a Jewish researcher, who wrote a book called The Developing Mind, to come to the Vatican, because Pope John Paul had read his book and wanted to have a conversation with him. John Paul's mother died when he was 7 years old. 7 years old. And John Paul said to Daniel Siegel, "The only thing I remember about my mother is her gaze." And Siegel said to the Pope, "You had a wonderful mother." We call it mirroring. We call it reflecting. Our faces are mirrors of one another. And that's how you stay connected, through the face to face, the mirroring. I get a sense of who I am, and you get a sense of who you are by our mirroring with each other. So Ralph Ellison, a black man, writes a book, and what's the title? The Invisible Man. The man who's not seen, who's not mirrored. And it's so important that we are in communities that are honest in terms of how they see us and read us and understand us, so we get honest feedback from one another, and we get a sense of who we are and who we are not. It's called reflecting. It's called mirroring. That's how we get a sense of who we are, and we don't feel like strangers in the world. So education has a lot to do with how we deal with one another and see one another. It's also how two selves stay connected. Let me give you a couple other ways that we stay connected to each other, and that's through play. Paul McLean, a neurologist, says in order for the brain to develop, we need three basic things. Audio, visual stimulation, which you had this morning, and play, we had that this morning, and nurture. Okay? Play is so elemental. If you can't get together through play, you only have one other option, and that's through hostility. Poking, pushing, shaming, guilting, dumping, fighting, whatever. Okay? And we call it hostile dependent coupling. That's the only way some people know how to get together in group and families that way. Rather than having spontaneity, letting go, surrender, playing, and some modicum of humor. So, mirroring, playing, and I mentioned nurturing. And of course, the primary way we're nurtured is through food. In our brains, there's this formula. Food equals love. Okay? The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. The companion is the person with whom you break bread. Churches and groups that eat together stay together. One of the tragedies of our day is that 3 out of 10 meals on the average in families are at home. 7 out of 10 are outside of the home or alone. Okay. We build sense of self by connecting to food. And then the fourth one is touch. Touch is powerful. Now, we do live in a society where there's been inappropriate touch or inadequate touch, and that's always a danger. But touch is still incredibly important. I grew up in a Protestant church that would not allow us to dance when we were adolescents. Because if you danced, you would touch. And you would have these ideas. When I was 13, I said to my 2 older brothers, something's wrong with me. I haven't danced yet and I have these ideas. Sidney Girard, when he wrote his book, The Transparent Self, counted how many people on the average in 4 different cities, how often did they touch each other? You know, in Atlanta, they touched each other on the average of 2 times. In London, they never touched. In Paris, they touched almost 100 times. And in Rome, they touched 150 times. The moral of the story is, if you want a real good massage, you look for an Italian. I don't know. But touch is important, and it's not just kinesthetic, physical, it's also verbal. Let's stay in touch. It creates community. It helps us to stay together. All right, I have time for a few questions if anybody wants to ask. Yes. Could you stand and speak loudly so we... Oh, wonderful. Wonderful, yes.
What about the 4th child?
What about the only child?
No, the 4th child. You mentioned the 1st, 2nd, 3rd.
What about the only child?
The 4th. 4th.
4th child. They tend to say the 4th child will begin to be more functioning like the 1st child. It gets repeated again after each other. The only child tends to be more like the 1st child. That's how that child most often is treated. Yes?
I was wondering about autism and in kids these days, is how it's on the rise.
I'm sorry, remember I'm deaf in my left ear, so I'm having trouble hearing you.
Kids who suffer from autism, can you talk about their brains and how they might differ in that human that area frame?
I can't respond to that because that's such a long, drawn-out thing, but There is some theory that those who have autism don't even recognize other people's faces. And if that's true, there's no connection going on. Because our faces are so important for us in making connections. There's some other theories too about autism, Asperger's and so forth. Yes.
I'm the fourth born of 6 children and the first twin. What does that make me?
Well, some people get a really screwed up position. Your life should be more interesting than the rest of us. If you're interested in that, the man who has done a lot of work is Kevin Lehman, L-E-M-A-N, and there's also another one, I can't even think of his name right now. But there are interesting things about birth order. But again, remember, it doesn't determine as much as it formulates. It's somewhat like genes. We've often thought genes will determine who we are. But a gene is always dependent upon an environment for activation. So wherever we are in terms of the environment, may mean what genes are going to take place. There's 12 possibilities in every gene, something like that. That's why this whole discussion of nature versus nurture is sort of an endless discussion. They're a system in themselves and around. All right, a couple more.
Could you just comment on
Did we go to 12, 15, or 12? 12, okay.
how our brains, how we can continue to grow and sort of reroute our neural pathways and strengthen them throughout our lives?
Okay. When my son purchased a dog, the veterinarian said, if you will give this dog as many different experiences as you can in the first 6 months, you're going to have a wonderful dog. Now, that's true with dogs. What does that mean for us? I think the more we can experience different situations, different conditions, different data and facts, the greater our expanse. You know, I said to my wife, she did not go with me to South Africa because I was tied up for 7 days doing some training. But I said, I was so glad I was in South Africa because I could see pictures. And the pictures are not the same as being there. Okay? I mean, seeing a lot full of garbage and seeing the poor rummaging through it to have life. I mean, to experience the actual seeing of that. So I think the more experiences, the more exposure, the more angles of vision you have to have in your life, there's the greater learning. Another hand. And then my conclusion. Yes, back here.
Would you be willing to speak to the process of the connections between differentiation and a sense of aloneness?
A sense of what was the last word?
Aloneness.
Aloneness.
Yes, sort of an existential aloneness.
There's a strong emphasis in Bowen theory about the importance of being a self. And the theory says, the better self you are, the better relationship you're going to have. Okay? Now, aloneness, I would say a better differentiated person would be able to deal with aloneness better than someone who isn't differentiated. Yet, you really can't learn to be differentiated alone. You have to do it in relationship. So it's a real paradox. On the one hand, yourself will develop more because of the relationships you have. Yet if you are alone, you'll be able to deal with better because you are differentiated. That would be what the theory would say. Now, just in closing, there is a phrase in systems theory, Bowen theory, called the non-anxious presence. And again, that's a metaphor. That's not a reality. I mean, you can always be non-anxious present by not being present. But what it means is it's so important that we make some choices and decisions relative to our behavior rather than just to let the natural parts of our lives prevail over our thoughtful and intentional part of our life. responsive and reactive. That does not mean that the less undifferentiated person will have more problems. What it means is the less differentiated person will have more problems with the problems they have, not necessarily with the problems themselves in terms of quantity. Whereas the more responsible, capable person may even have more problems than the undifferentiated, but will have less problems with the problems. I hope that is understandable. I want to thank you for the invitation